The desert sun burned like fire, and 5 children stood alone in the wasteland, no water, no food, and no hope. The youngest, barely 6, clutched a torn doll as the wind howled around them. Then, in the distance, a lone figure on horseback appeared. Was he salvation, or something worse? The dust kicked up behind Jake Colton's horse as he rode through the barren stretch of Nevada desert. He wasn't looking for trouble, just a quiet place to rest after weeks of drifting. But trouble had a way of finding men like him. Up ahead, a small figure darted across the sand. Jake squinted. A kid. Then another. And another. 5 of them, the oldest maybe 12, the youngest barely able to walk straight. Their clothes were ragged, lips cracked from thirst. The oldest boy, Tommy, stepped forward, eyes wary but desperate. "Mister, you got any water?" Jake hesitated. He'd been alone for years, and kids meant complications. But the way the little girl, Sarah, looked up at him, like he was some kind of miracle, made his chest tighten. He uncorked his canteen and handed it over. "Drink slow," he grunted. Tommy took a careful sip, then passed it to the others. "Our wagon broke down," he said. "Pa went for help 3 days ago. Ain't come back." Jake scanned the horizon. No tracks, no sign of anyone. Just empty desert. A bad feeling settled in his gut. "You kids alone out here the whole time?" Sarah nodded, clutching her doll. "We ate the last of the beans yesterday." Jake exhaled. He hadn't signed up for this. But leaving them wasn't an option. "All right," he said, swinging off his horse. "We're finned in, you some shade first. Then we figure out what's next." The kids exchanged glances. For the first time in days, they had hope. But Jake knew better than anyone, the desert didn't give up its secrets easy. And whatever happened to their pa, it wasn't gonna be good news. The scorching sun hung heavy in the sky as Jake led the children toward a cluster of rocks that offered meager shade. The little ones stumbled in the sand, their energy fading fast. Sarah, the youngest, tugged at Jake's coat sleeve with weak fingers. "Mister, my feet hurt," she whispered. Without a word, Jake scooped her up and settled her onto his horse, her tiny frame barely adding any weight. The other children watched with tired eyes, too exhausted to complain. Tommy, the oldest, kept glancing back the way they had come, as if expecting his father to appear any moment. But the desert stretched empty in every direction, just sand, wind, and silence. Jake knew they couldn't stay out here for long. The nearest town, Silver Creek, was at least 2 days' ride, and these kids wouldn't last that long without proper food and water. He cursed under his breath. He hadn't asked for this. He was just a man passing through, not some hero. But the way Sarah's head drooped against his shoulder, her breathing shallow, made his decision for him. They needed shelter. Fast. As they reached the rocks, Jake helped the kids settle in the shade. He pulled out his last strip of dried beef and broke it into pieces, handing them out. The children devoured it like it was a feast. Tommy hesitated before taking his share. "You ain't gotta do this, mister," he said, voice rough. "We ain't your problem." Jake met his gaze. "Ain't about problems. It's about what's right." Tommy frowned, like he didn't trust kindness. "Pa always said folks don't do nothin' for free." Jake didn't answer. He'd learned long ago that the world was full of men who took and men who gave. He'd been both. Right now, though, he just needed to keep these kids alive. Night fell, and the desert turned cold. Jake built a small fire, the flickering light casting long shadows on the rocks. The children huddled close, their faces gaunt but finally resting. Sarah curled up against Jake's side, her doll clutched tight. He draped his coat over her, ignoring the chill biting at his own skin. Then, in the distance, a sound. Faint, but unmistakable. Hooves. Jake's hand went to his revolver, his body tensing. Tommy heard it too, his eyes widening. "That Pa," he whispered. Jake didn't answer. The rhythm was wrong, too fast, too many riders. And no one traveled this deep into the desert at night unless they had a reason. The firelight reflected off something metallic in the distance. A badge? A gun? Jake's jaw tightened. Whoever was coming, they weren't friendly. And with 5 exhausted kids to protect, running wasn't an option. He leaned down, voice low. "Tommy, listen close. When I say so, you take your brothers and sisters behind those big rocks over there. No matter what happens, you stay there. You understand?" Tommy swallowed hard but nodded. The hoofbeats grew louder. Sarah stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about her doll. Jake exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about who was coming for them, and why. The riders emerged from the darkness like ghosts materializing from the desert wind, 3 men on horseback, their faces obscured by dust and shadow. The firelight glinted off the metal of their guns, but they didn't draw. Not yet. The lead man, a broad-shouldered figure with a hat pulled low, dismounted first. His boots crunched on the dry earth as he stepped forward, his eyes scanning the children before settling on Jake. There was no recognition in his gaze, only cold calculation. Jake kept his hand near his revolver but didn't reach for it. A fight here would mean bullets flying too close to the kids. He had to play this smart. "You lost, friend?" the man asked, his voice rough like gravel. Jake shook his head slowly. "Just passing through. These kids needed help." The man's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "That so?" He glanced at Tommy, who stood rigid, fists clenched at his sides. "You there, Pa?" Tommy opened his mouth, but Jake cut in. "Their wagon broke down. Their father went for help days ago. Never came back." The man exchanged a look with his companions. Something unspoken passed between them. Jake didn't like it. One of the other riders, a lean man with a scar across his cheek, nudged his horse forward. "Ain't no wagons out here for miles," he said. "Just dust and snakes." Sarah whimpered in her sleep, her small fingers tightening around her doll. The sound made the lead man's expression flicker, just for a second, before his face hardened again. Jake kept his voice steady. "We'll be moving on at first light. No trouble here." The lead man studied him a moment longer, then shrugged. "Suit yourself. But this ain't safe country for kids." He turned to mount his horse, then paused. "You see any strangers out here, anyone a skin, questions, you ride the other way. Understood?" Jake nodded, though the warning sent a chill down his spine. These men weren't just passing through. They were looking for something. Or someone. As the riders disappeared back into the night, Tommy let out a shaky breath. Who were they? Jake watched the darkness where the men had vanished. Trouble. The fire crackled, the only sound in the heavy silence. The children stirred, sensing the tension but too exhausted to question it. Jake knew they couldn't stay here. Those men would be back. And next time, they might not be so polite. He made a decision. "We leave now," he said, kicking dirt over the fire. Tommy blinked. "Now. But it's dark. And those men know where we are," Jake interrupted. He grabbed his saddle and started securing it to his horse. "We head east. There's an old mining camp about 6 hours from here. We can rest there." The children exchanged nervous glances, but no one argued. They'd seen the look in Jake's eyes, the same look their father had when he knew danger was coming. Sarah rubbed her eyes as Jake lifted her onto the horse. "Where we goin'?" she mumbled. Jake adjusted his hat, his voice softer than usual. "Somewhere safe." But as they rode into the night, the desert stretching endless around them, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that safe was a word that didn't exist out here. Not for them. Not anymore. Because those men hadn't been looking for just anyone. They'd been looking for these kids. And Jake was going to find out why. The moon cast long shadows across the desert as Jake pushed the group forward, his horse moving at a careful pace to accommodate the exhausted children walking beside him. Sarah dozed fitfully in the saddle, her small body swaying with each step the horse took. Tommy kept close to Jake's side, his eyes darting into the darkness every few minutes as if expecting those men to reappear at any moment. The other 3 children, Billy, the quiet twin brothers Eli and Samuel, trudged along in silence, their feet dragging in the sand. They had been walking for hours, and the mining camp Jake had mentioned still wasn't in sight. A cold wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke. Jake stiffened. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. But out here, people were just as likely to be dangerous as they were to be helpful. He signaled for the kids to stop, then dismounted, handing Sarah down to Tommy. "Stay here," he murmured. "I'm gonna check something." He moved forward on foot, his boots making no sound in the soft sand. The smell of smoke grew stronger, and soon he saw the flicker of flames ahead, not a campfire, but the remains of a burned-out wagon. Jake's stomach tightened. It was the same kind of wagon Tommy had described, the one their father had taken when he left for help. The canvas covering was charred to ashes, the wooden frame collapsed in on itself. A few scattered supplies lay half buried in the sand, a dented canteen, a torn piece of cloth that might have been a shirt. And then Jake saw the body. A man lay face down near the wreckage, his clothes blackened by smoke. Jake didn't need to turn him over to know he was dead. The bullet holes in his back told the story well enough. Footsteps crunched behind him. Jake spun, hand going to his gun, but it was just Tommy, his face pale in the moonlight. The boy's eyes locked onto the body, and his breath hitched. "Pa." Jake grabbed his shoulder before he could move closer. "Don't look, kid." But it was too late. Tommy's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, his hands shaking. "They killed him," he whispered. "They killed him and burned the wagon." Jake didn't have words. He'd seen enough death to know that sometimes, there was nothing to say. He crouched beside Tommy, gripping his shoulder. "We need to move. Whoever did this might still be around." Tommy wiped his face with his sleeve, his voice thick. "Why? Why would they?" A rustling in the darkness cut him off. Jake yanked him behind the wreckage just as a gunshot split the night. The bullet kicked up sand where they'd been standing seconds before. "Jake!" Sarah's terrified scream came from further back, where the other children were waiting. More gunfire. The twins cried out in fear. Jake cursed. They were surrounded. He shoved Tommy toward a cluster of boulders. "Run! Get to the others and stay down." Another shot. Closer this time. Jake drew his revolver, his mind racing. This wasn't just bad luck. This was an ambush. And those men from earlier? They hadn't been strangers. They'd been killers. And now they were back to finish the job. The gunshots echoed through the desert like thunder, each blast sending the children scrambling deeper into the rocks. Jake pressed his back against the burned-out wagon, his revolver gripped tight as he scanned the darkness for movement. They were outnumbered, 3 men at least, maybe more, and with 5 kids to protect, fighting wasn't an option. They needed to run. But the desert offered no cover, and the children were already at their limit. Sarah's sobs cut through the night, her small body trembling as Tommy clutched her close. The twins, Eli and Samuel, crouched low behind a boulder, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. Billy, the quietest of the group, had gone completely still, his eyes wide with terror. Jake knew that look. He'd seen it before, in men who'd stared death in the face and come out the other side broken. A shadow moved near the edge of the wreckage. Jake didn't hesitate. He fired once, the shot ringing out like a crack of lightning. A man cried out, stumbling back into the darkness. "Jake!" Tommy hissed. "We can't stay here." He was right. But where could they go? The mining camp was still miles away, and the gunmen had horses. They'd be run down before they made it halfway. Then Jake remembered the canyon. It was a gamble, a dangerous one. The narrow pass cut through the rocks like a jagged scar, its walls steep and unstable. But if they could reach it, they might be able to lose their pursuers in the maze of stone. "Listen close," Jake whispered, pulling the children into a tight huddle. "We're gonna make a run for those rocks to the east. Once we're there, we head straight for the canyon. No stopping, no looking back. You understand?" The kids nodded, their faces pale but determined. Even Sarah wiped her tears away, her tiny fingers gripping Jake's sleeve like a lifeline. Another gunshot. Closer this time. "Now!" Jake barked. They ran. The desert floor blurred beneath their feet as they sprinted toward the distant rocks, the gunmen's shouts chasing after them. A bullet whizzed past Jake's ear, so close he felt the heat of it. He didn't slow down. The twins stumbled, their legs giving out from exhaustion. Jake yanked them up without breaking stride, half dragging them forward. "Keep moving." They reached the rocks, gasping for air. The canyon loomed ahead, its entrance a dark mouth waiting to swallow them whole. Jake risked a glance back. The gunmen were mounting up, their horses kicking up dust as they spurred into a gallop. They'd be on them in minutes. "Into the canyon," Jake ordered, shoving the children forward. "Stay close to the walls." They plunged into the narrow pass, the towering stone walls closing in around them. The air grew cooler, the moonlight barely piercing the thick shadows. Somewhere above, a loose rock clattered down, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Tommy grabbed Jake's arm, his voice a panicked whisper. "What if it's a dead end?" Jake didn't answer. He already knew the truth. If it was, they were all dead, the canyon walls pressed in around them like the jaws of some great beast, the narrow path twisting deeper into darkness. Jake kept one hand on Sarah's shoulder as they moved, her small fingers clinging to his coat like she feared the shadows might swallow him whole. Behind them, the twins stumbled over loose rocks, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Billy brought up the rear, his head swiveling constantly as he listened for the sound of approaching horses. Only Tommy walked with any steadiness, his jaw set in a hard line that made him look far older than his 12 years. The gunmen's voices echoed faintly from the canyon entrance, their words distorted by the winding stone passages. Jake knew they wouldn't stay on foot for long, horses could navigate these passes, and the men would be on them before they found a way out. He scanned the walls for any break in the rock, any hidden crevice that might offer shelter. Then he saw it. A narrow crack in the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. It might lead nowhere. Or it might be their only chance. "Here," Jake whispered, herding the children toward the opening. "Through there. Quick and quiet." Sarah balked at the dark slit in the rock, her doll clutched tight to her chest. "It's scary," she whimpered. Jake crouched to her level. "I know. But I'll be right behind you." He nodded to Tommy. "You first. Take her hand." One by one, they slipped into the crevice, the cold stone scraping against their arms as they shuffled sideways through the passage. Jake went last, pausing just long enough to kick dust over their tracks at the entrance. It wouldn't fool the gunmen for long, but it might buy them time. The passage opened suddenly into a small cavern, the air stale and thick. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the ceiling high above, painting faint silver streaks on the stone floor. The children collapsed against the walls, their chests heaving. Tommy wiped sweat from his brow. "You think they'll find us?" Jake listened. The distant clop of hooves on stone echoed through the canyon outside. "Not if we're quiet." Billy, who hadn't spoken in hours, suddenly lifted his head. "What's that?" A sound. Faint, but unmistakable. Dripping water. Jake moved toward the back of the cavern, his hands brushing the damp stone. There, in a shallow depression in the floor, a tiny pool of water glimmered in the dim light. It wasn't much, just a seep from some underground spring, but it was clean. The children rushed forward, cupping their hands to drink. Sarah giggled as the cool water trickled down her chin, the first happy sound any of them had made in days. Jake allowed himself a moment of relief. They had shelter. They had water. Now they just needed. A gunshot rang out, the blast deafening in the enclosed space. Stone shattered near Jake's head as a bullet ricocheted off the cavern wall. "They're here!" Tommy yelled, dragging Sarah back from the opening. Jake spun, his revolver already in hand. The gunmen hadn't found the crevice, they were shooting blindly into the canyon walls, hoping to flush them out. But it was only a matter of time. Then Eli gasped, pointing upward. "Look!" High above, where the moonlight streamed through the cracks, the ceiling of the cavern wasn't solid rock. It was an old mine shaft. Wooden support beams, rotten with age, crisscrossed the opening. And beyond them, a way out. Jake's mind raced. The shaft might collapse at the slightest disturbance. Or it might be their only path to safety. Another gunshot. Closer this time. They had seconds to decide. The gunfire outside grew louder, bullets pinging off the canyon walls as the men closed in. Jake knew they couldn't stay, the shooters would eventually find the crevice or simply wait them out. The mine shaft above was their only chance, but those rotting beams looked ready to collapse at the slightest touch. Sarah whimpered as another bullet ricocheted nearby, the sound like a hornet buzzing past their ears. Jake made his decision fast. "Tommy," he said, keeping his voice low but urgent, "see that broken beam near the wall? We're gonna boost the kids up one by one. You first, then you pull the others up after." Tommy didn't argue. He scrambled onto Jake's linked hands and hauled himself up, his fingers clawing at the splintered wood until he wriggled through the opening. A shower of dirt and pebbles rained down as he disappeared into the shaft. "Eli next," Jake ordered. The twin was light enough that Jake could lift him straight up into Tommy's waiting hands. Samuel went up just as quick, his brother grabbing his wrists to pull him through. Billy hesitated, his eyes darting between Jake and the dark opening above. "They ain't gonna hold," Billy whispered, staring at the groaning beams. Jake knew he was right. The wood was dry-rotted, the nails rusted through. But they had no choice. "Move fast and they will," Jake said, boosting him up. Sarah was last. She clung to Jake's neck, her doll crushed between them. "I'm scared," she breathed against his cheek. Jake hugged her tight for half a second, just long enough to feel how small she was, how fragile, then lifted her toward the shaft. Tommy's arms appeared, grabbing her under the shoulders. As her feet cleared the opening, the beam beneath Tommy's knees gave an ominous crack. Jake jumped, catching the edge of the shaft as the entire entrance collapsed behind him in a cloud of dust and debris. For one terrifying second, his boots scrambled against nothing but air, then Tommy and Billy hauled him up by his arms, their faces strained with effort. They lay gasping in the pitch-black tunnel, the only light coming from thin cracks in the ceiling far above. The gunfire outside had stopped. Either the men thought they'd buried them alive, or they were searching for another way in. Tommy coughed in the dust-choked air. "Which way now?" Jake forced himself to his knees, running his hands along the tunnel walls. The wood here was slightly sturdier, the air carrying a faint current that suggested an opening somewhere ahead. "We follow the draft," he said. "Stay close and don't touch the walls." They moved in single file, their hands linked to avoid getting separated in the dark. Sarah's fingers trembled in Jake's grip, her other arm wrapped tight around her doll. The tunnel sloped upward gradually, the ceiling so low in places they had to crawl. Somewhere behind them, a section of timber groaned and gave way, the crash echoing through the narrow space. No one spoke. They all knew what that sound meant, there was no going back. After what felt like hours, Eli suddenly stopped. "I see light." Ahead, a faint glow outlined what might have been an old ventilation shaft. As they neared, the outline resolved into a ragged hole just big enough to squeeze through. Fresh air poured in, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. Jake peered out first. The shaft opened onto a steep slope dotted with scrub brush, the canyon walls stretching below them. In the distance, maybe a mile east, the faint glow of lanterns marked what had to be the mining camp. Safety. But between them and that safety, movement caught Jake's eye. 3 figures on horseback circled the base of the slope, their hats pulled low. Even from this distance, Jake recognized the broad-shouldered leader from before. The man paused, turning his head slowly as if sensing their presence. Jake pulled back from the opening, his blood running cold. They weren't just random outlaws. They were hunting the children. And they weren't giving up. The mining camp's lanterns flickered in the distance like mocking stars, so close yet impossibly far with armed men between them and safety. Jake pulled back from the shaft opening, his mind racing. They couldn't go down the slope without being spotted, and the tunnel behind them had collapsed. The children huddled around him, their faces gaunt in the dim light filtering through the cracks. Sarah pressed against Jake's side, her doll's button eyes reflecting the faint glow. Tommy kept peering out the opening, his hands clenched into fists. "We could make a run for it," he whispered. "Split up, they can't chase us all." Jake shook his head. The men had horses and rifles. The kids wouldn't make it 50 yards. There had to be another way, some advantage they hadn't seen yet. His eyes scanned the slope below until he noticed something odd. One of the gunmen kept glancing toward a specific cluster of boulders near the base of the hill, his posture tense. Like he was guarding something. Then it clicked. Horses. The men wouldn't have left their mounts unattended in open terrain. Those boulders had to be where they'd tied them up. Jake turned to the children, keeping his voice barely audible. "Change of plan. We're not running to the camp." He pointed to the boulders. "We're stealing their horses." Billy's eyes widened. "That's crazy." "It's crazier to think we can outwalk them on foot," Jake said. He focused on Tommy. "You know how to ride?" The boy nodded. "Good. You'll take Sarah and Eli. Billy, you're with Samuel. I'll cause a distraction so you can reach the horses." Jake hesitated, then yanked a folded knife from his boot and pressed it into Tommy's hand. "Cut the reins fast. Don't stop for anything." Sarah grabbed Jake's sleeve. "What about you?" He adjusted her doll's frayed dress, a useless gesture that felt necessary. "I'll be right behind you." They waited until the gunmen drifted further along the canyon's edge, then slipped out of the shaft one by one, keeping low in the scrub brush. The moon ducked behind clouds as they crept downhill, the darkness their only ally. Jake counted each step, 20 yards to the boulders, 15, 10. A rock clattered behind them. One of the gunmen spun, his rifle glinting as he raised it. "There." Jake didn't think. He shoved the children behind a sagebrush and stood, firing 2 quick shots toward the men. Not to hit them, to draw their fire. "Run," he bellowed. Bullets kicked up dirt around him as he sprinted parallel to the kids, drawing the gunmen's attention. Tommy reached the horses first, sawing through the reins with Jake's knife. Sarah scrambled onto the nearest mare, her tiny hands fisted in its mane. The lead gunman roared in fury, spurring his horse toward Jake. "You're dead, Drifter." Jake dove behind a boulder as bullets splintered the rock above him. He was pinned down, the camp still too far to reach on foot. Through the gunfire, he heard the thunder of hooves, Tommy and the others racing toward safety. At least the kids would make it. Then an odd sound cut through the chaos. A whistle. High and sharp, like a bird call that didn't belong in the desert. The gunman froze. The lead man's face went pale under his hat. "No," he breathed. "Not now." A new figure appeared atop the ridge, silhouetted against the moon. Then another. And another. At least a dozen men on horseback, their rifles aimed downward. The lead gunman wheeled his horse around. "Ride." Jake didn't understand who these newcomers were, but he didn't wait to find out. He lunged for the last remaining horse as the canyon erupted in gunfire. Sarah's scream carried over the chaos. "Jake!" He turned just in time to see one of the newcomers take aim, not at the fleeing gunman, but at the children. And Jake realized his terrible mistake. These weren't rescuers. They were the reason those men had been hunting the kids all along. The gunman's rifle gleamed in the moonlight as he took aim at Tommy and Sarah. Jake's heart hammered. He was too far away, his own horse not even mounted yet. There was no time to reach them. But just as the shooter's finger tightened on the trigger, a deafening crack echoed through the canyon. The gunman jerked sideways, his shot going wild as he clutched his bleeding shoulder. Jake whirled toward the source of the gunfire. An old man with a long white beard stood atop a nearby rock, a smoking rifle in his hands. Behind him, a group of armed townsfolk from the mining camp fanned out, their weapons trained on the newcomers. "That's enough bloodshed tonight," the old man growled. The would-be attackers hesitated, then, seeing they were outnumbered, spurred their horses into retreat. The lead gunman spat in Jake's direction before vanishing into the darkness. As the dust settled, Jake finally got the truth. The old man was Sheriff Cobb, and the children's father had been carrying something far more valuable than supplies, a ledger proving the town's mayor was embezzling gold shipments. The gunman had been hired to silence him and anyone who might have seen the evidence, including his children. "You risked your life for these kids," Cobb said, eyeing Jake. "Why?" Jake looked at Sarah, now clinging to Tommy, her doll still clutched tight. "Because once upon a time, he said quietly, someone should have done the same for me." Moral lesson: even in the harshest deserts of life, kindness is the one treasure that never runs dry. A single act of courage can change everything, not just for others, but for your own soul. Epilogue. A week later, Jake stood at the edge of Silver Creek, watching the children board a stagecoach to live with their aunt back east. Sarah pressed her doll into his hands, a thank you. Tommy shook his hand like a man, but his eyes were wet. As the coach rolled away, Sheriff Cobb handed Jake a badge. "Town could use a man like you." Jake smiled for the first time in years. Somewhere, a new story was beginning.